Welcome to the Inside Scoop Live podcast, where indie authors get personal about their books, their writing, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt. Join me for some lively conversations with debut indie authors and seasoned veterans alike. It's a great place to find your next amazing read or even get inspired. So sit back and enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. Matthew Byrne and Denis Jenkins join the show today to discuss their new book, Mutuality, The Future of Trust. It's a comprehensive guide exploring how mutual thinking and trust can transform organizational culture and adaptability in today's complex business landscape. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the authors. Matthew Byrne is an expert in executive leadership and corporate strategy with credentials from the University of Technology, Sydney, and Harvard. As adjunct faculty and program director at the Australian Graduate School of Management, he helps leaders align personal strategies with corporate goals. With over 15 years of collaboration with Denis Jenkins, Matthew specialises in transforming corporate cultures by shifting managers from process thinking to strategic thinking. Denis Jenkins is a leader in neuroplasticity and cognitive training dedicated to transforming how people learn and lead. His early work in education, alongside Helga Rowe of the Max Planck Institute, shaped his groundbreaking approach to learning acceleration. A recipient of the Australian Sentinel Medal, Denis now works with individuals from students to CEOs, helping them build trust and strong organizational cultures. And to learn more about the authors and their work, visit their website at mutualitythefutureoftrust.com. Well, hi, Matthew and Denis. Welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to learning more about your work. So let's kind of get started with the big picture. What is the book about? Mutuality, The Future of Trust, and what led to its creation?
So Denis and I have been working in the field of leadership development and organizational effectiveness and efficiency, for most of our lives. And one of the things that has always been a problem is the generation of trust within organizations. As we grew up through the ranks of organizations and started working ourselves, the main form of trust that was basically expected within the organization was what we call transactional trust. That's the trust based on your performance, based on how you execute the tasks, based on how good your judgment is. And we tried to avoid building relational trust at any cost. There was always these mantras that you should leave yourself at home and only bring your business self to work. And over the period of time, that has changed, and we now are expecting people to bring all of themselves to work. And that requires us to have more relational trust and trusting in our relationship in order to be vulnerable, in order to be able to have difficult conversations, in order to share that we may not be good enough to do the job.
You see, the problem that I saw in it as well, Matthew, is the fact that we are so focused on trust and generating this trust. And no one was really working out how that you gain the trust. And what we did is we thought about it long and hard, and we found that what was missing was the concept of mutuality. Mm-hmm. Mutuality is what brings trust in any kind of relationship outside the corporate world. If you do not actually connect as people in terms of relationship, how are you going to actually create any trust? And so this is what caused us to think about writing the book, is because we thought a big missing piece was evident in the corporate world.
And just to add to that, now that people are aware that that piece is missing, they actually don't know how to get there.
No.
Because all their expertise is based around transactional trust. So they avoid trying to build that relational trust because they don't know what the building blocks are.
And not only that, but a lot of people in leadership in the corporate world see mutuality and all of those relational things as being a waste of time. They want to get on with the job. You are not going to be able to get on with the job if you don't have trust and if you don't have mutual relationship, because there is no real commitment of the people to the task if you don't actually have mutuality.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right.
I think we're so programmed for transactional kind of interaction in most things. It's safer, it seems like, in the workplace.
You don't have to bring self to work.
Yes.
You don't have to
Exactly.
bring your issues to work or your emotions to work. And you see in the corporate world, a lot of leaders in the corporate world are dead scared of dealing with people's emotions, dealing with people's sense of being within themselves. You see, they like to just get on with the job, which is, what we really are there in the corporate world for. It's like if you're in a sport, if you don't actually have all the sport skills to carry out the activity within the sport, you are not going to be able to win the game, are you? And it's the same in the corporate world. If you don't have those skills of mutual relationship, you're not going to win the game.
Just to add to that, it is safer, but not more effective or efficient. So we avoid having difficult conversations. We avoid having to disclose certain information. And when we talk about this in the organizational sense, it's not really, am I having difficulty with my 17-year-old daughter at the moment? It's more about, am I having difficulty trying to actually execute what I'm being asked to do and generate the outcome because I actually am stretched beyond my capacity to be able to do that? And am I okay to tell you that I think I'm going to fail and that I need help in order to complete this work? Or do I fear that if I do that, that might be to my detriment and I might actually lose my job? And a lot of us have some worldviews and biases that we hold. That means that I'm not going to tell you that I think I'm not capable right at this moment to be able to do that. That's basically what happened.
And you see, Matthew, what you're saying there is the fact that people often think of mutuality as purely getting into the emotions and understandings of individuals. But mutuality is also helping each other to develop expertise and skills and all of those sorts of things, and to have an open environment so that you can admit when you need to be upskilled in something in order to cope with it. Where in the traditional environment, to admit that you need more expertise is almost to say, I can't do the job.
Yeah.
Right. Now, you mentioned understanding the how kind of seems to be the missing piece, but why is the trust in workplaces eroding today in the first place, you think? And then how do you get people to understand the how?
That's a really good question. And what we know is that the work in organizations is becoming more complex because the rate of change is increasing. Also, the environments in which we're working are changing quite dramatically. New governments come in, they change the way we think about certain things. They expose us to different types of risks within organizations, and we have to adapt and pivot in those moments. And that's where transactional trust doesn't actually work anymore. So we've had this sort of era of the last 30 years where we've been able to work with transactional trust because it allows us to be quite predictive and predictable in the way that we are doing things. Whereas now that predictability doesn't actually help us to solve the problems. And what we actually need to know is that the people who are doing the work, or that I'm asking them to do the work, do I actually trust them, not their capability to be able to get the task done?
You see, transactional trust is dependent upon whether you can deliver, you see. Mm-hmm. Where relational trust is recognizing the fact that we're facing some hard times. We're facing difficult situations. And delivery is not always the measure of me trusting you in this particular situation. And what the trust is built on is that you are prepared to, in a relational sense, tackle things that have never been tackled before, but believe in each other to the extent that you can be very open, you can admit things that you need to admit, you can work on things to create solutions that haven't actually been thought of before in that particular context. And so it's that fluid relationship that you actually have with each other in really difficult circumstances. And you can actually see that happening in governments around the world. They are facing horrendous circumstances. And yet, because it's a transactional trust issue, this is why the governments are coming and going and coming and going, and no one has any opportunity of fixing the problem because of change and changing contexts. And this is where things need to become a lot more relational worldwide and corporately.
And I think what you're saying there is really important because, mutuality is not something that is new. Mutuality is not something that has, never been heard of before.
Yeah.
Mutuality has always existed. And there are people who are quite mutual with each other because they have found ways of building strong connections with each other.
Yes.
And often that happens because we went to the same school. We come from the same town. We follow the same hockey team. I'm using a Canadian analogy here. And we don't play hockey in Australia. And we work in the same profession.
Yes.
We are the same ethnicity. We are the same gender. We have all of those things. And so therefore, we quite quickly build really deep connecting relationships. But in an organization, not always do we have those people working with us.
Yes. The other point, too, is in that kind of relationship you're talking about, Matthew, is that we are not only mutual about the interests that we have, but we're also mutual in developing one another in the skills that we need to manage the information from the environment in which we're working. We are prepared to take risks together and so on. So you see, mutuality goes beyond just believing the same thing. You can actually believe quite different things and still be mutual because we respect each other. We support one another. We like the way that we can actually communicate together and all of those sorts of things that give us, like we use in the book, the concept of we start out with the string and the more we relate together, it becomes a rope.
And that rope is strong enough in order to have difficult conversations. Now, in a work organization, we don't like everybody, or there is not a natural affinity to build a mutual-based trust. So now what we need to do is we need to do that intentionally rather than just happening out of effect. And so rather than saying, I dismiss this person because of the way they think or the way they look or where they come from, I can actually looking to find things that I have in common with them. And often we have very difficult relationships at work where it seemingly is, when we started working with these people, impossible to find anything that these people have in common. And we've been able to end up building enough string and enough rope between those relationships for them to be able to very effectively work together. Did they become best friends and go to each other's weddings? No, they didn't. But they were able to work very effectively as a team in order to achieve the outcomes that they were both pursuing.
And also to actuate mutuality in relationships within a work process, it's a good thing to have curiosity about the other people around you so that you can begin to understand them even though you don't necessarily agree with them, you see. And then in understanding them, you know how to relate to them in such a way that you can actually gain the very best out of those people rather than making our differences separate us. So therefore, the mutuality we're talking about is the mutuality that brings people in diversity together, not necessarily just people who have the same interest.
I mean, DEI is coming under attack at the moment, and there are worldwide people who are challenging the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we believe that organizations have been probably not very effective and very efficient in being able to implement those within their organizations because they think about diversity as something that is physical rather than diversity of thinking. And one of the things that organizations need at the moment is this diversity of thought. And in order to create diversity of thinking, you need to make those people who think differently feel included. And so we need to be able to understand that if we're having a group of people around the table that probably don't like each other and probably have all the reason in the world not to be in the same room with each other, yet these are the people who are going to save the organization, then how do we listen to them and how do we give them a voice? But how do we make them feel included enough to stay at that table in order to speak their voice?
How do you take down those walls so you can start having an effective relationship?
Some of the skills in bringing those walls down is that leadership need to understand that they need to place in their framework of operation time for necessary things like relationship. Everything is usually so fast moving that no one really can explain their position on anything. And very often the trust actually is eroded by the fact a person has been given a responsibility, but that person really needed help in that responsibility and was unable to ask for it. And then when they weren't able to deliver, the organisation distrusts them because they have not actually done what they were asked to do. But the point is, in mutuality, you've really got to spend a little time to understand what are the needs of the people who you have actually given responsibility to.
Mm-hmm. Your book outlines 6 archetypes that can get in the way of mutuality. I want to hear about all of them, but I guess in the essence of time, can you maybe share one example of how it affects an organization?
Right. For a start, we've got to understand what cognition is about. Cognition is not just thinking about things. Cognition is the way the brain sets itself up into what we call tools of the mind. And some of the examples of tools of the mind would be, how can you effectively analyze? How can you effectively comprehend something? Well, to effectively comprehend things, people have to have good classification and good categorization skills. For a person to execute something, they need good, what is called motor integrative skills. And that is the capability of setting up a strategy, a plan, and a process in their mind, and then the capability of putting it into action in terms of the eye-hand coordination, brain-hand coordination processes as well. And a lot of these things actually place a barrier against people actually achieving things in a corporation. So we actually have a testing process that tests these cognitive skill bases, and we're able to even predict what people's behavior is going to actually look like according to their graph, you see. And we have actually given entire groups this test, and the management have believed that they have chosen a homogeneous group of people who are able to work together. And then when you see the results of their cognitive skill base, you see that hardly anybody is able to relate to the other because of missing cognitive functions and cognitive efficiencies and so on. So what we really need to be doing here is we need to be helping these people to achieve cognitive functional efficiency and capability so that it is possible for people to be on a level playing field and being able to think together rather than being lost in the information management process because they can't actually manage it and process it because of their cognitive process. So therefore, when we actually talk about the various skill bases, we then see that we have 6 divisions of skill capability that has actually been shown as a result of thousands of tests, you see. And it's interesting how they group themselves in those bases. And so therefore you might have one lot of people who have high conceptualization but very low motor integration. They are not going to be able to think about things and design things and then execute them, you see. And what they've also got to realize, if they don't have the motor integration capability, they need to find people in their organization who do have that capability and learn to delegate more effectively to those kinds of people, you see. So that's why we have those 6 different positions of cognitive capability, which is mainly driven by what is required by the corporate world. That's what actually determines those 6 divisions. Because you see, you can go outside the corporate world and you will find other groups as well of people in different ways.
Yeah, and we found that 85% of the 4,000 tests that we have run fall into these 6 categories within an organization.
Yeah.
And I think, just to reiterate, if they're cognitively all the same, It doesn't mean they think the same. That this means that they can effectively process information. Their worldviews and their biases will still be shaping their contribution that they make and how they talk about that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's
So,
what people often think, They often think that if you have equal capability, you're going to all think of the same thing. But you're not. You're going to be thinking of all diverse things, but you have the capability of bringing it together into making one thing.
does the book outline how leaders can help develop these skills in their people?
Yes, so there's one chapter, chapter 10, which basically outlines all of those 6 archetypes and gives you a detailed description of how to manage yourself if you identify as an archetype.
Yes.
Then also how you can effectively manage someone else who is that archetype.
Yes.
What are the things you need to work on in order to change that archetype? And how you can actually develop your brain in order to become less bound by that archetype and be more fluid across your information processing capacity.
In fact, we have workshop booklets that we use, that we teach people in leadership. And, you don't actually have to be a manager to be a leader, by the way. It's people who are prepared to stand up and be counted. And so these workshops that we do is we teach people how to actually go through and look at all of these different skill bases and to be able to, by the behavior of the individuals, determine what they're actually missing, and even before they're tested. And so, but also these workshops, we teach them how to actually manage people who are missing some of these cognitive efficiencies and cognitive capabilities. And so it makes a world of difference, which then creates mutuality amongst people and between those who are leading and those who are a part of the team, because there is a way of managing people who are different in terms of their cognitive capability. And this is what is not understood in the corporate world. They don't know how to deal with people who are different. And this is why diversity is not actually working, really, is because they don't understand how they can be mutual and yet so different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess I'm just wondering, when you're working with companies, or not even companies, but just with maybe an individual in general, do you feel like there's a lot of pushback when you're trying to move from transactional to relational trust? I mean, to me, it just seems like people are more inclined to stick with the problems they know because it feels easier, like the whole devil you know kind of thing.
I totally agree with you. And I was that person for many years. I was, as you would call, a master or a black belt master in conflict avoidance and never expressing my true feelings. So, I'm a convert to this quite late. And I can tell you that we think it's easier because we don't have to have that difficult conversation. And we don't have to have those probing questions that saying, why are you feeling down at the moment? Why don't you like this person? What is upsetting you about this? Because often what that does is it forces us to reflect on ourselves rather than to basically just push the whole blame onto the other person. I always say 2 things. I said, when there is a conflict between 2 people, I said, what part of the mess are you? And what part of the mess is the other person? And I said, don't worry about the mess of the other person. That's their responsibility. Worry about your part of the mess. And when they are able to lean into their part of the mess, they are able to be far more intentional with what they're wanting to do. The thing about not doing this is it forces us to not be intentional, but to be reactive. Unfortunately, what happens is, as much as I tried to do this, every now and again, somebody will trigger me and the emotion comes out. and when the emotion does come out, it usually is in a more damaging outcome than if I had said, I'm about to lose control here because we are not sticking to the agenda. And people say, why is the agenda so important to you? I really need to understand why that means something to you, that I am able to express that. And sometimes I can't express that. Sometimes I'm going, I don't know why. It's just making me feel really, really irritated and anxious at the moment. And sometimes we need to sit with that in order to find the words to be able to explain that. When we do, then everybody understands why it is important. And if we respect that person, then we will stick to the agenda because we want to help them to be able to do their best possible job.
And you see, this is the key to mutuality, and that's respect. Respect of the person rather than purely respecting the outcome of their actions and behaviours, you see. Because very often people need help in terms of the outcomes of their actions and behaviours. And if we respect them enough, we will understand and give them that help rather than isolate them and cause them to feel as though they've been cast on the outer edges of the company. You see, a lot of problems that occur in the corporate world come from politics of isolation. And if we could cut through the politics of isolation because of perception and then turn to a mutual solution rather than a political isolation type process, we would be able to draw on more skills, more capabilities, because there are so many people who are not operating at their full potential because they're afraid.
Mm-hmm. So what does mutuality look like in the remote workplace? Because that's such a big, that's not going away. That's here to stay. What does that look like?
This is such a question of the now, and every day in our workshops, people are asking us that question of what that looks like. We need to understand that when we're at the workplace together, there is some incidental building of mutuality that takes place. We overhear other people's conversations. We make a coffee and have an incidental chat with people. And that does not exist when we are working from home. And so therefore, what has happened is when we do a Zoom call, and that becomes more about talking about the tasks than it does actually talking about where am I at today. And so one of the things that is important is that when I'm managing someone whose report, that I don't just understand what they are, but I also need to understand who they are. And sometimes having a conversation with them about who they are is more important about a conversation about what they are. And so what they are is a project manager for me that is executing 3 projects. Who they are is a mother of 3 children who's trying to balance a household, raising their kids in economic tough times with inflation and other issues that are facing her, in what she is passionate about and what she truly enjoys talking about. And if I can understand who this person is, then I can have short conversations with them about their passion. And when we're in the office, we tend to have those conversations because I know that someone's into pottery and because they bring a cup in. I said, oh, that's a nice cup. And I said, oh, I made that myself. Those are the things that start to explain about who you are and how you want to be rather than what you are.
But you see, the pandemic also had diverse effects on people. You see, what Matthew's describing is the people who gathered around the coffee and the water fountain and so on. But you see, a lot of the executives, they are isolated in their offices. They are isolated because of the pressure that is actually coming upon them in the organisation. Now, in our book, we actually have characters. We have Mark and Sarah, you see. And in the beginning of the book, Sarah was facing the pandemic and she just was beside herself because she had to organise things like computers that people didn't have at home that they could use and all of this sort of thing. But you see, what the pandemic did for Sarah, it forced her to come out of her office and to connect with people that she would have not otherwise connected with, you see. And she then became more understanding of people. And then she was able to start building a mutual relationship with the team that she had that she really never really knew as well as she did during and after the pandemic. So you see, the pandemic has affected people in different ways, you see. And not only that, but yes, there are more people working from home. But I have a daughter who's working from home. But what she has said, I've never had more connection with my managers above me than when I do work at home. Because when I'm in the office, they're in their office. When I'm at home, they very often feel freer to actually pick up the phone and say, "Oh, how are you going? How's the job going? What's happening?" Where what would have happened if she was in the office, they would just look over your shoulder in silence to see what you're doing,
Yeah.
rather than communicating with you about what you're doing.
Right. Right.
And I believe the pandemic forced people into mutual understanding.
Yeah.
Well, you come together in crisis. That's what people do.
Yes.
It's natural, but it's not natural to capture that same sense of unity without a crisis. That seems like that's the challenge. Yeah.
And that's the hard thing. And what has happened is that we have identified that we create unity through a challenge and a common enemy. And we've been doing that as societies for the last 30 years. We've been doing that as organizations for as long as we can remember. And that is becoming exhausting for people. And we're now seeing long-term effects of people struggling with anxiety, people struggling with burnout, people opting out of the system and actually deciding to not work in the traditional structures of organizations and are deriving their income through other means. There was this one article that talked about that Harvard still graduates a huge amount of law graduates. 72% of them would go to law firms. Now it's only 44%. And
Wow.
The question was asked, what's happening to all the other ones? And they said, well, they've got their education. They're doing something totally different with it now.
Mm.
They're YouTubers and they are Instagrammers and they are gamers and doing that kind of stuff. And so we're struggling in organizations to attract the talent that we need in order to move forward, because those people are saying, I'm not buying into that anymore. I'm not buying into that. We have to constantly be under pressure because there's a common enemy that we have to fight.
And you
Right.
asked the question right at the beginning, what motivated us to write the book?
Mhm.
What really did motivate us was the fact that we had experienced mutuality during the COVID period. And why should we move back into our isolationist processes again? And so therefore we are encouraging people not to lose the mutuality that we had when we were facing a crisis together.
Okay. So if a leader wants to build mutuality within their team, where's the best place to start?
Very good question. The best place to start is to have a conversation about mutuality, but have a conversation about mutuality, not trust. Trust, because the moment to bring the word trust in, it will polarize our views. And some of us will think, oh my God, we're going to get blindfolded. We have to fall backwards and they're going to catch us. But if we have a conversation about mutuality, that then is a different conversation we're having about how do we build better connection. And once they have that conversation and people are interested in mutuality, then they can get cognitive profiles. And cognitive profiles don't cost a lot of money. And some of them are actually free that they can actually get in order to do that. And then once they have that, then that allows them to be able to reflect on their issues that they're having and trying to be mutual. And then they can, out of that, create a learning environment to develop some principles and practice that lead them towards that goal that they want to pursue. And then they can develop their individual cognitive tools. Dennis, you can talk more about that.
And when they have the results of the cognitive profile in front of them, they begin to understand why people are struggling. And then they're able to put policies in place that are going to assist those people who are struggling. Because a lot of people have a tendency to hide their incapacities. And then the management become really upset because they thought they could trust these people to do this and this. And why they've failed is not because they've actually fallen back on being trustworthy, but they have not been able to get the kind of help they needed that the cognitive profile will actually show. And once they understand people from that perspective, the workshops that we have teach management how to support and scaffold people who don't have all of the cognitive functions that are necessary. And it then brings a mutuality between management and their team, and it also opens up the team.
Okay. And what are the signs that all their efforts are coming together and working to create this new work environment?
So in the companies that we've worked with and we have been able to follow that kind of process, the companies have reported that they have become more effective and more efficient. And we use effective and efficient a lot because we need people to be effective first before they can become efficient. Often what happens is we take people who are ineffective and try to make them efficient, and that just perpetuates the problem. And they become more profitable. And so we help organizations to really help them to become ultimately more profitable. And when we talk about profitable, we're not just talking about financial profitability. We're talking about service profitability. We're talking about non-for-profit profitability. We're talking about public service profitability. And so we measure that profitability in multiple different terms, not just in financial. So that's what we see. What we look for as we're trying to achieve that, we look for some lead indicators. We look for higher investment in outcome from the people who are participating. We measure that people are taking a higher level of responsibility. We also measure that people are collaborating more rather than cooperating. And we also measure that there's higher conflict without being defensive. And there are organizations all around the world who actually do this. And someone who's actually listening to this podcast right now will say, that's exactly you describing my organizations. And then and my comment to that is saying, congratulations, hang on to that as long as you can. You're on the right path.
One of the really big measures is people stepping up in a higher level of responsibility. You will find that your team or your group of people that you are working with as managers will, without being pushed, will step up and take responsibility because they know they are not going to be shot down by management because of that. And that is one of the great effects of mutuality.
We listen for things like, oh, this is above my pay grade. I'm not paid to do this. To, I had an idea and I took action on it. We measured those two ends of the spectrum.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So do you work with individuals or companies or both? And do you have information on your website for people interested in working with you or taking a step beyond reading the book?
Yes, we do. So we work with individuals. We also work with organizations. And so when we work with individuals, it's more around the personal development. And when we're working with organizations, it's more about the systemic development of the organization. We often get called to organizations where there are real cultural issues with trust. So we don't often get called into organizations that are practicing perfect mutuality. So we live in the space that is in the opposite spectrum in order for that to take place. That information is on our website, on the book. There are links on there to be able to take the test. And there are also links on there to be able to contact us and get more information on that, on what's happening there. And we're also about to put some case studies up on that website as well.
Okay. And that's mutualitythefutureoftrust.com.
That's the one. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So what's next for the two of you? Are you working on any new projects or will you continue in this field?
We have so many projects on the go that it's just working out which one we're going to choose to do what with, you see. So we've been like this for 30 odd years, you know, and I've actually got, before computers were the big in thing, I have a 4-drawer filing cabinet full of projects, and we've just got to pick which ones are most applicable. So what would you say to that?
For me, mutuality and trust are the big game changers in organizations for the future. And so I have been working for the last 20 years in trust and mutuality, and that's not going to change. No. And I think for me, the biggest feedback I'm getting from the readers so far is that this is all very good to explain mutuality, but how do I actually implement that within an organization? How do I actually change the culture of the organization? And how would mutuality help me in doing that? And I think that's a challenge that has been thrown to us that we're sort of grappling with about how would we answer that question? How would we make a meaningful contribution to that conversation?
Well, the first thing that people can do is book in to a workshop. Book into individual development. That's what they can do straight away. And they can even book in to actually just talk to us to understand a bit more about it, to know what they need to be connected to in what we do.
Okay.
And when we say workshop and things like that, it doesn't have to be our workshop. I have found that if people go out there and actually start to learn again, they start to experience the world in a different way, and that creates profound change.
Well, Matthew, Dennis, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure getting to know more about you and your work. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for the time.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Sherry, for allowing us to speak on this program.
And I just love your mutual interest in this.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Matthew Byrne and Denis Jenkins. To learn more about the authors and their work, visit their website at mutualitythefutureoftrust.com. And be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.